before we move on with our panel, I do want to make a couple of comments. I do want to mention Karen Cracknolan and tell her that our best wishes are out to her. She's really been a big driven this event from the beginning, and we hope she gets better as soon as she can, as well as she can. Also in that talk, you heard a lot about landslides, and you heard a lot specifically about Rick Wooten. Rick is with us today, and Rick, I hope you don't mind me pointing you out. There's Rick sitting right there. So if you have landslide questions or if you want more information, you can catch Rick during the breaks or during lunch or after the event. So with that, we'll start. I'll introduce our panel members. What I'd like to do here is introduce each member, give them a chance to make a brief comment if they want to. If not, we'll move on to the next one. And then we'll just open it up to the audience to ask questions. Hopefully we'll get some good ones. If not, we've got some things we can get it to move along. First panel member is Chris Crew. Chris has been with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management since 1998 and has been the state mitigation officer since 2005. He's a certified floodplain manager. Chris worked with the local governments in Western North Carolina to identify and set goals and standards for the implementation of the Hurricane Recovery Act of 2005. This included nearly $35 billion in funds that were reimbursed to local governments for infrastructure repairs, among other things, including $4.5 million in repair to the then Blue Ridge paper mill on the Pigeon River in Canton. Chris says he's a preservationist and a brewer, and I thought this was interesting given the historic nature of this event. He says he's a founder and trombone player in the historic Oakwood Second Line Band. So, fun to have historic that is. Chris?
Great, thanks. That was million, not billion. We wish it was. Just a couple of opening comments. Can you hear me okay? Do what the director calls a drinking chicken? Good. Every disaster is different. The only thing that I've found in almost 20 years of dealing with them is that the standard about them is they smell the same. They smell like sewage and diesel and pine sap for some reason. Some of our response is necessarily on the fly because disasters are different. But building this culture of mitigation and framework fueled by good judgment and compassion is what we can do to be better prepared. And we're good at that. Can somebody turn up the gain a little bit on this?
Yeah.
Go. Okay. During the period from 1803 to 1950, Congress passed 128 separate laws addressing disaster relief. Prior to that, there was no standard for disaster relief. That's a new law every 14 months for 147 years. Can you imagine Congress moving that fast these days? Because there was no single overriding legislation covering disaster relief or any specific federal agency assigned to the task, Congress had to pass a separate law to provide federal funding for each major disaster that they chose to address. Now, there were certainly more than 128 disasters in that period, but a lot of them, were left to the individual to address. In 1950, the federal government, Federal Disaster Relief Act was passed, and the fundamental principle of that was that it was designed to supplement the efforts and available resources in state and local government, not to supplant them, but to support them. In 1968, the National Flood Insurance Act was signed into law, and community participation is required through the adoption and enforcement of prudent development and construction techniques in identified floodplain areas. So, it's us, it's relationships. Good government is built on this trust that we get from having a relationship. Good mitigation requires that we listen to the voices and appreciate the values of everyone involved. And we have to be willing to discuss things that may not be pleasant. Several times in the last 20 years, local governments have said, we're not going to talk about that because that makes it look like this isn't a good place to work, play, and live. We have to have the trust to be able to talk about these things. Mitigation, really what I do, takes place outside of the bounds of emergency response. It happens before the storm, it happens after the mud dries. And our communities have worked together, particularly in North Carolina, in planning and project implementation to the degree that we are a national model for what we do. The state government has been very supportive of our efforts too. North Carolina has the biggest hazard mitigation staff of any state in the country. In the last 20 years, more than 5,000 properties have been mitigated in North Carolina. And in order to get the federal funding to do this, we have to show a 1-to-1 benefit cost ratio over the life of a project, which may be anywhere from 30 to 100 years. So out of these 5,000 properties, we've had a few dozen opportunities to go back after a subsequent disaster and do some analysis and see what we saved in a single event. And the average works out to, for every single mitigation project that we've done, we have saved 70% of the project cost the first time it was tested. And we've got 100 years to recoup the rest of that. So there's evidence that it does work. And then finally, what I can discuss with you is the Hurricane Recovery Act of 2005. And we talked earlier today about some of the trust between the local and the federal government and the state government. Because there were communities who had not lived up to the federal end of the bargain prior to the floods of 2004, federal disaster relief was extremely limited. So the state government stepped up with the Hurricane Recovery Act of 2005 and laid out $42 million. That was the portion that came through mitigation. The entire bill, I think, was $124 million put up by the state of North Carolina to address these issues. We talked about government and the perception of how Western North Carolina is treated and respected, and some of that may be accurately reflected in this bill, in that of the $42 million for mitigation, $8 million of that went to Hyde County for a new courthouse, and $1 million of it went to Ocracoke for repairs to a school building. This was the Hurricane Recovery Act of 2005. They weren't impacted by Francis and I. It was a minor event there. So Will Rogers, the great American, said, laws and sausages, you don't want to see how they're made. So I'll leave it with that, and it just suffice it to say that we have built these relationships, and the important thing is to maintain them when the sky is blue and the ground is dry. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And you have listed on your program our third member of the panel, being John Gerber. John is with his reserve unit right now, and while we wish he was here with us, we do appreciate his service. So taking his place on short notice is Randy Mundt. Randy's the outreach coordinator for the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, and he is the certified floodplain manager. And one of his main duties is to introduce new flood maps to local communities. So you can imagine how that goes over sometimes. So don't be afraid to ask Randy your toughest question. Okay?
I'll hear the report. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Jim and Chris didn't leave me a lot to talk about, but I did make a handful of notes that I just want to kind of reemphasize. My background is in local planning. I worked at the local government level. I used to be a floodplain administrator. And reflecting back 100 years ago, there was no such creature at any of the communities. So in terms of lessons learned, the state and the federal government have learned that these are types of events that we can assess, we can identify those risks, and we can start applying some development standards through the National Flood Insurance Program, as Chris mentioned. Back when I was the position that Chris has now, one of my jobs was communicating and coordinating with communities on developing their hazard mitigation plans. And up here in the western part of the state, one of the points that I'm wanting to tie back in is about lessons learned. We learn lessons and then we forget them. And it's one of the things that today and tomorrow, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of good things, but it's the repetitive nature of remembering what it was that we already learned and what we've heard before. So when I was up here in 2001, 2002, 2003 in the mountains, and I was saying, you know, you got to do a hazard mitigation plan, you got to deal with flooding. Almost universally, I heard it doesn't flood it. And so I was, in some ways, I was fortunate that 2004 came because that was a lesson that could be relearned. And at certainly a cost, but again, now I think that the state is better prepared for those types of events. The position I'm in now, I work with the floodplain mapping program in emergency management, and after the considerable events of '96 with Hurricane Fran and then again in 1999 with Floyd, the state took a very good look at what the federal capabilities were. And at that point, we were working with flood maps across the state that would range from 15 to 30 years old. Of course, flood risk does increase over time as development occurs above you in the watershed, that water gets down too faster. And at that point in time, FEMA was usually able to update 1 or 2 counties per state per year. And after Floyd recognizing that nearly half of the 100 counties were affected and were working off of old maps, the state took the good measure to go ahead and say, let's be proactive, let's communicate and cooperate, and actually we became the first state in the United States to actually run FEMA's mapping program for them here in the state. And in 10 years, we were able to update all 100 counties with new data. Back in the day, prior to that, a lot of the maps would show you, okay, this is an area at risk to flood in, but it wouldn't be able to give you what that water surface elevation would be, so that you could say, you can build here, but the rule of thumb is maybe you want to build 2 feet above grade. That's not a heck of a lot of help. And now, since we became their partner, we have updated 29,000 stream miles across the state with, for the most part, new models with base flood elevation, so that if somebody does want to develop in those areas that are identified at risk, they have some understanding not only from sound building standards that are reflected in the National Flood Insurance Program and are also mirrored in the North Carolina Building Code, but they also know that, okay, we might want to build a little bit higher than what the base flood elevation is, because recognizing with the floods of 1916 and with Floyd especially, 85% of the structures that suffered damages were outside of those areas mapped at risk of flooding. So a lot of communities take on higher standards than what FEMA says built to the base flood elevation. Since that time, the state of North Carolina has also recognized trying to tie in not only the identification of risk, but how do you communicate that risk, and then how do you take steps to mitigate that risk that Chris's program does a great job of. And so we recognize that it's great to be able to identify where the water hits the ground, but what really is important is to know where the water hits the building. And so we took the step of digitizing over 5 million building footprints in North Carolina, which is a data layer, which is digital. Our flood layer is digital. You can start doing an analysis between the ground, the buildings. We've started coordinating with local tax offices so we can start getting information on, okay, we've got a building there. Can you tell us more about what is the value of that building, so that if we can start seeing if we're going to have 1 foot of water on this building or 3 feet of water on this building, what are the comparative damages? And then that helps build into the cost-benefit analysis that Chris is needing whenever they want to do some buyouts or some elevations. So I've already said a bunch, but I want to make sure I leave you with one thing. We're the floodplain mapping program, and that everybody probably has a smartphone or a tablet or a computer. It used to be that you had to go down to your town hall or the county planning office to take a look at the maps. You can now look at that 24/7 on your smartphone. That website, just Google in NCFRIS, North Carolina Flood Risk Information System, NCFRIS. You can see what the effective risk is, and as we update data that goes through a statutory due diligence review process, you can see what the preliminary data shows as well. And we are now in the process, a long process along the coast of updating the coastal model, which hadn't been updated since the 1980s. You can imagine the comparison between technology and knowledge of risk and what we have that we are approaching when we are dealing with those coastal counties. Also talking about identifying risk and being able to forecast into the future. When we got into the flood mapping program, we also developed the flood inundation mapping and alert network. Back when we got started, for the most part, we had, I think, 90 gauges across the state. Most of those were going to be North Carolina related, and now we have over 540 gauges, where we're able to take a look at precipitation and river gauge data, and we can start taking a look at real time, and we can start doing some scenario-based planning so that you can say, okay, it's a dry day now, but we know sometime down the road it's going to rain hard. What's going to be effective? Because again, that's a digital data layer. Take a look at your building footprints, take a look at your critical infrastructure, your key resources such as hospitals and roads and pipelines and all. And again, I'm kind of just going over old ground that Jim has already covered. But I do want to point out that North Carolina is exceedingly lucky. As Chris pointed out, we have the largest component of mitigation planners in the United States. We lead the nation in our mapping program, which helps identify where those risk areas are. We're doing this all digitally so that people at any point in time, as long as they have connectivity, can go ahead and see what those risks are. I want to see if there's anything else. Again, the main point, I think, really is we're trying to save lives and property. We're trying to use this in a proactive fashion to look forward and say, okay, well, here's an area, and again, up in the mountains, economic development traditionally has been where we've got flat land, and guess what? That's where it floods. That's the floodplains. So, trying to recognize that there has to be a balance struck. That's always going to be a tension between economic development, wanting to have people have jobs to be able to contribute to the economy and have a nice life, and recognizing that those floodplains still do have beneficial functions just in their own state. They're natural and beneficial functions, and there's a new type of a theory that I'm not real familiar with, basically talking about there is a value to those environmental services that those functions and those floodplains do provide. I think that's probably about it, and I'm happy to answer any questions for the rest.
Okay, well, thank you, Randy. And what we'd like to do now is kind of open it up for questions for the panel. And if you would please just raise your hand. If you need me to bring a microphone to you, I'll be happy to do that. If you could raise your voice, and panelists, if you would repeat the question as best you could. Yes, ma'am.
So there's a lot of data that goes into the planning. It seems like we've come a long way. Really enjoyed what you showed today, Tim. Especially, I'm wondering to what extent data has been gathered to deal with those scenarios that could happen with the supply chain. So if we switch to natural gas and the natural gas is cut off for 3 days, what happens and how do we deal with it? What data and planning is done?
Yeah, so the question was the data that's available for planning and then running future scenarios. And so scenario planning then really starts becoming important as we start looking at options. And so now is actually a good time to be collecting some of that data, like in partnership with Duke and things. What are their options? What is their plan for that? Because again, we as citizens basically pay for our electrical power through them, and they are the ones there to basically guarantee that availability. And so through the laws of the state of North Carolina, that's something that we can actually ask Duke for what is their options in providing that uninterrupted services. And so that's, something legally we can just ask them to provide. Now, at NEMAC, we haven't done that, but certainly I think, the city of Asheville and Bucks County can do that, and then we can integrate it into the rest of the plans we're putting together.
Yes, sir.
Yes, this can be directed to anybody. I mean, certainly, Jim, you touched on this a little bit. Going back to the 1916 flood, one of the things that makes it incredibly unique, but also replicatable, is that it was a months-long event that led to the flood. In particular, the week before, so not even a week, July 11th, the French Broad broke its banks and actually took out a retention wall of a house that was demolished in the 16th flood. So it had something set up to protect itself, and then that was gone on the 11th. 16th, it comes and wipes out the house. And so what I'm wondering is, with everything that's going on with slides and multiple flood events within this short period of time, the kind of data you're collecting, the kind of plans that are being done, are they planning for these kind of multiple events going on? Or can you actually plan for that? So is it single events in the sense of like one big flood, or is it, a possibility of being able to handle, multiple kind of situations?
I have a little bit of an answer for that, and oddly enough, it relates to drought, not to flooding. We have lately, we have been working in the risk management section of NCEM on some risk assessment tools. We've got the footprints and finished floor elevations of every building and floodplain in North Carolina. We're working on some tools to assess individual risk in terms of dollars, because we have come to the conclusion that if we can tell you how much this is going to cost you, people may be more interested in dealing with it. But now back to the drought. We're trying to add a drought component to this, and in looking at local drought plans, what we find is that most of those are based on a single trigger point. When the water level in the reservoir gets to this mark on the stick, then we've got a problem. And what has only recently been brought to the table is, well, when you're at that mark on the stick, you're too late. What we need to be looking at is the rate at which your reservoir is declining. So, very good and interesting question. And the engineers will always tell us we don't know what we don't know. So history is the example. That Dr. Fox talked about that.
I think a lot of times when you start asking those sorts of questions, you need to really look at kind of what we like to talk about, the 2 R's. And that then really talks about who the decision maker is. And the 2 R's are resources and responsibility. And too many times in our society, we try to transfer the responsibility and therefore ask for resources. And we know in our society that there aren't enough resources for all of that. And so when you start looking at insurance and flood insurance versus, landslide pieces, I think a lot of our policies, that we're starting to look at for these things is trying to really make people aware of what, dangers they face, and then let them make the decisions about what, they want to do about it as well, too. The problem with that is a lot of times the people that build the structure is not the people that inhabit it. Especially here in the mountains, we have a lot of vacation homes that people come into, and they don't know the danger that they're in. And so this is a really complex issue, but it really gets down to how do we effectively communicate, that for either short-term responsibility or long-term responsibility, and how do we make sure that people are, really able to afford, replacing something or being aware of when to get out of harm's way. And I think that's something that our state is doing a tremendous job on. And we couldn't provide our tools without the investment that the state has made through these agencies. These 3D models we're working on, they're tied to something called LiDAR information. This is very detailed elevation model, collected at a very fine detail. The state of North Carolina invested in that. The building footprints, federal agencies like NOAA providing, not only past information, but projections of what's going to happen, is we as a society are really now have a lot of data and information on our hands. Our failing is getting that into the right people's hands at the right time. And I think meetings like this really start addressing that. How do we actually communicate that and getting a lot more people aware that, oh, we do have a problem with flooding and landslides in the mountains. And we always need to be aware of that. So I think, anytime you start looking at scenarios, it's really getting down to this communication to be addressing those two forms.
I'd like to tack just on one more little bit to that again. Floodplain mapping program, having the digital data and the flood risk information system, what we're moving to is trying to be able to support both local mitigation planning, giving them all of those statistics, crunch those up, because again, I've worked at the local level, and most of the folks that are developing their hazard mitigation plans are doing that in addition to 3 or 4 other jobs. And being able to give them a lot of this information condensed and compiled for them in advance at the gross level, at the community level, but also being able to, with a point and a click, be able to identify, this is my building, and if there's a 10-year event, because we're tied in now to the tax records, and I know what the value of that structure is, within a tolerance, I can find out what the damages are. If it's a 100-year event, what the damages are, and then I can start playing around with, okay, well, what are some of my mitigation options? Do I want to elevate some of my utilities? Do I want to provide flood venting? And we have the ability to be able to start showing what some of those benefits and costs would be for that at the local level and at the gross local level or at the specific site level.
Okay, another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, after the 2004 flood in Biltmore Village, studies were done to suggest mitigation to avoid that type of an event in the future, primarily at the Swananoa River watershed. One was managing the reservoir better, 2 was direct park detention ponds, and 3 was the pinch point at the Biltmore Avenue Bridge. And I'd just like to understand better, of those 3 recommendations that came out of that study, how many of them have been implemented, and are there any funds available in the future for the ones that have not been?
There's going to be some people on the third panel, I think, that may be able to answer that.
That's what I was going to say. McCrae Coates is in the back, and he's going to be able to provide a really great answer to that. And so, McCrae, I don't know if you want to.
Well, we'll save that for the third.
We'll talk over lunch. I'm on the third panel with him. So.
A quick answer to the middle part of your question about retention ponds is people talk to our mitigation specialists a lot about, well, why don't you just build a retention pond over yonder to take care of this? And I think in general people don't have a grasp on how much water we're talking about. They don't understand that 1,000 square feet of water that's 10 by 100 feet by an inch deep. Anybody have a guess how much water that is? That's if we poured an inch of water in the front of this room here, we're talking about 600 gallons of water. And coming down the Swananoa, I don't know what the typical flow is, but it's in the rate of thousands of gallons per minute regularly. So that's part of the problem.
Yes, sir.
It may tie into that question too. About a mile from here on Thompson Street, there's a large apartment complex going in currently, and it's about, I'd say about 200 feet from the banks of the Swananoa. It's been built up 12 feet. I'm sure that those buildings would be secure from flood, my question is, does that not take that portion of floodplain out of play during a flood and just push more water downstream?
You know, probably another question that can better be answered this afternoon, but I believe the flood ordinance that the city has is not only that you have to build up, but you also have to provide whatever space that you're taking in the floodplain, you have to provide additional space for that as well too, right?
Yes, the flood ordinance requires that you elevate the structure to the base flood elevation, but in that particular case, and again, I'm afraid that is the city baths already are, I should have said that. But our ordinance does allow to do filling in the floodplain, which is outside of the floodway, and those properties are outside the floodway. So when that ties to the state ordinance and state regulations and also FEMA regulations.
And if I can tack on to that from a floodplain mapping point of view, FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program's guidelines and standards does allow for development in the floodplain, and it is, to a certain extent, as long as you're not in that floodway, it does anticipate that there will be development, and that development will, of course, cause some obstructions to flow, but that's factored in when we show what that water consolidation would be.
When would you anticipate the flood?
We got time for just, one or two questions here.
Okay.
You've had your hand up a couple times.
Just one quick question. When will the next reevaluation of the floodway, 100-year floodway be done, do you think?
I should have been prepared for that question. I'm not. I'm going to say that we met with local communities last year, and it's about a 3-year cycle, so it'll probably be another 3 years, I think, before that data is released as preliminary.
You have questions?
I have a question on the development we have here in the mountains. It was referenced as steep slope development. We also have exposure on the coast with properties that are right on the coast subject to storms. My question really goes to insurance and reinsurance programs to allow those buildings to be built with a hidden subsidy, because the builders and the owners, they're not paying the full freight for that insurance. They have subsidy, which winds up being back in Washington. And until you get them to pay that full price, you're not going to get any kind of resilient construction for subsidies.
That's a little bit incorrect. For communities that are now participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, new buildings that come in that are built based on the knowledge of risk, they are paying actuarially. It's for the older structures that were built prior to knowledge of risk, prior to those flood maps, that receive the subsidies. So anything that's built right now should be built compliant with the maps in place at this time, compliant with the minimum standards of construction, and should be rated actuarially to that risk.